Actually, I've got a better one. So I heard this anecdote where the first time NASA built a space shuttle, they had to make the boosters much smaller than they actually wanted to make them. Why? Because the boosters had to travel from point A to point B on a railroad through a tunnel that went through the mountains. And the tunnel that went through the mountains was like a certain width, and they couldn't make the booster any bigger than that, right? It's the only way to transport it, right?
Huh. Okay.
You with me so far?
I am. So NASA wanted to make bigger rocket, can't make bigger rocket, must make small rocket.
So instead of doing one large booster, which would have had, whatever effect on the launch performance or who knows, right? They had to make like multiple smaller ones.
And that's the reason why the space shuttle has those two initial boosters on each side of the main fuel tank.
Isn't it like three on each? Like three little cones and whatever. It's fine. It doesn't actually matter. But so it's like you have this very, basically the most advanced transportation technology humanity's ever invented, constrained by this much older one, but it actually gets worse than that. The gauge of the railroad was based on the gauge of wagon wheels.
Of course it was.
Like in England, because that's where all of their so there's some I forget the connection now, but it was basically like all the original train engineers were all basing their gauges on the width of wagon wheels.
Okay.
And they'd used wagon wheels for however many hundreds of years. All the grooves and all the roads were cut according to the wagon wheels.
Sure.
And the width of the wagon wheel goes all the way back to the roads in Rome, which were determined by the width of a horse's ass.
You're listening to the Proof Partners podcast. For more information, check out proofpartners.io.
Nice.
I kid you not. So the width, so the dimensions of the rocket boosters on the space shuttle were determined all the way back by the width of a horse's ass of a Roman imperial warhorse. That's incrementalism, where it's like you just keep building on things of the past and you're constrained by those things. Sometimes you just have to burn it all to the ground.
Well, I was talking to a founder yesterday. It was a really fascinating conversation, and essentially talking about the same kind of concept of here's the industry he wants to go after, and it was had to do with APIs and connecting data and ETLs and so on things.
Yeah, and
the premise of the conversation was based on the constraints of today. And, I immediately sort of picked up on it because the context of the conversation brought it back to the target audience and how he was going to go to market and so on and so forth. And, there's no fault in being that way. I think we all do it. Right?
Yeah.
Whether it's NASA or myself as a founder or any other founder, I think we all do it to some extent. But being from the outside looking in, it's a little bit easier to say, well, wait, these are fundamental assumptions that don't have to be there.
Right.
But burning it all down isn't an option either. You can't, the rocket has to go through the mountain. The railroad is there. You are trying to get somebody to the moon, in 1950s.
Yo, yeah, look, you can't always do it. And by the way, calling yourself a founder feels a little bit pretentious.
Aren't we all founders?
We're founders of our lives.
I found my shoes this morning.
We're founders of our lives, man.
I pawed around and found the coffee machine.
No, I think the difference is, and sometimes you can't, right? Sometimes the constraints are such that you just can't, at least not in your approach. I think there's two different ways to think about it. One is sort of being blue sky in your vision of where you want to go, and one is in how you get there. So I think like for example, the iPhone, before that came out, it was a total paradigm shift. Everybody was in, BlackBerry is like all you think about in terms of the creme de la creme for mobile, computing, if you can even call it that, right? Mobile computing, right. Fancy telephony, whatever, right? So there's two different, sure. And actually this is sort of a counterexample of the, the process, burning it down in terms of the process. Or anti-incrementalism. So I watched the General Magic documentary recently, where they're basically trying to build the iPhone, 17 years before the iPhone.
It's great. Yeah,
and they failed. They crashed and burned. I mean, they got close. Like, if you look at the technology of the day versus what they were able to turn out, they did a pretty good job, but it was, way over schedule, way over budget, and they never ended up going to the market because of the stupid Newton, whatever, right?
They didn't realize that what they were really doing was just prep work for their next big job.
No, they didn't. But then
it's a great documentary, by the way. Everybody should watch it if you're interested in it. Like it's 2 hours of these technologists just fighting against the constraints of the day's infrastructure, right? So it's like, touch screens don't exist. LEDs are brand new. It's horrible. It's excruciating.
Mobile networks have never heard of this thing, and
exactly. They're trying to do data over non-digital networks.
Yeah. What they actually did, just in terms of coordinating the number of vendors and people who hate each other sitting at the same table in a conference room, like that, and it's like, forget the technical achievements, they pulled that off. Like,
which is oftentimes harder than
Sony
the
Sony
tech.
and Samsung. Yeah, no kidding. So they got so close, and who knows, maybe with another 6 months or a year or whatever, they would have done it. But Steve Jobs turns around 17 years later, hiring one of the main engineers, Tony Fadell, who we know, which was really cool to see.
Yep.
He hires him, says, "Hey, I want to build a music player," and it was the iPod. And he knew at the time that the iPhone is where it was going to end up. However many years later, what was it, like 5? Was the iPod like 2001 or something like that?
The 5. First one, it had a little mechanical disc in it. It was amazing. It had one of those little hard drives.
Yeah,
it actually like spun up.
I had one. I had one. Yeah, I remember the FireWire and all. It was great.
Yeah. You drop it and you're toast.
Yeah, but he knew back then that so in a way, getting into the music player market was really just a way to ship a product that he would eventually pivot to a phone, which is also a music player, but that wasn't the important part.
He wanted a computer that you could hold in your hand.
Yeah.
Right. So it was the iPad. Well, there was the Newton, first of all.
Yeah.
He tried that. That was way before its time and failed kind of before it was premature.
Well, that was before Steve came back and he scrapped all the products except for like 4.
Right.
So I don't even think he cared about the Newton. He actually cared about Alan Kay's idea of the Dynabook, and which, to your point, is why the iPad was actually the first product that he wanted to do, but the technology wasn't there yet. So I'm assuming that's why he's like, okay, we're going to do a music player that's eventually going to turn into a phone.
I think this goes back to one of the other conversations that we were having about not just first principle thinking and kind of throwing out the established playbook and getting back to the very basics, which is also important. We could do probably a whole series on that.
Yeah.
But the idea that when you have a goal as a business, it has to be audacious enough that it gives you room within the various sub-projects or sub-ideas to navigate them.
Yeah.
In other words, if all Steve Jobs had to continue with the Steve Jobs example, which is not my favorite thing to do, but if all Steve Jobs had in his head was a mobile music player,
Yeah.
he probably would have come out with a slightly better Walkman.
Right. And everybody would have said exactly what they said when the iPod launched, which is, what's this? It's,
Right.
not particularly impressive compared to anything else on the market.
Right. And it's the same thing with Elon Musk, which is kind of where we started, right? Which is, he decides he wants to create an electric car for various reasons. He puts it on a Lotus sports car chassis. It turns into this massive multi-year struggle, and the performance is impressive in some ways, but completely lackluster in others. If that is all he wanted to do, was make a 2-seater roadster that happened to have an electric motor in it, then that's where Tesla's journey would have gotten very, very difficult.
Right. Exactly. Because you can't sustain that there's not even a point to that level of innovation on such a constrained vision.
But there's two difficulties with this. The first is, how do you do that? How do you come up with the idea of where you want to go that's big enough to sustain you through all of the twists and turns of business, but not so big that it's impossible to communicate to yourself or others and believe in? That's the first one. And then the second one is, how do you do that outside of physical products, right? Both of the examples that we've brought up are physical products. How do you do that with tech?
Okay. Communicating the vision. Well, so okay. Communicating the vision. That's kind of the first. Articulating and communicating the vision.
Sure.
Okay. I mean, it depends on the vision. Like, I don't think it's that hard, because, like, I don't know, what's a good example where it's like even ubiquitous computing. That's kind of a physical hardware one.
I think it is hard. So I run into business all the time where the most that they can communicate, the most detail that they can get about what it is that they're doing is that, make more money.
Yeah. Well, that's confusing the outcome with the byproduct, which I think is that's its own topic.
But they do that because that's what they can see.
Yeah.
That's a vision. They go, and they pick a number, right? Because they want the number to be big enough.
Right.
And, so maybe they're making $10 today. They want to make $100 tomorrow, and it's, it's 10x or whatever. And that's their vision. And it doesn't go beyond that.
Well, I don't think that's going to inspire people. It doesn't inspire, colleagues, doesn't inspire customers, and it's going to come out. Like, it's going to come out in the things that you do. People are going to see it. Nobody's going to care.
I agree with that.
I think the real challenge is for people who have very, very abstract visions that aren't necessarily disconnected from reality, but are so far removed from what the norm and the standard is today that you actually can't get people to see it, or it's extremely difficult because there's so much packed into your own head that it's like, how do you get that out? How do you translate that into words or into pictures so that you can put it into somebody else's head? I don't know if I have any good advice for that. I don't know if I have any advice for that.
All right. Well, what about the second one? I might have some ideas on that. I think I've spent a lot of time thinking about how to vision cast, just in general, for my own life, but also in the context of building businesses, and people have like the big, hairy, audacious goal.
Right.
There's a whole book about that and so on, and it's an art. It's not a science.
Yeah.
And it's also a different podcast, so we needn't go into it. But
yeah,
in brief, it's essentially you've got to you personally as a leader have to have a really strong sense of what you want to accomplish with your life in general.
Yeah, I
think that's really important to keep you from becoming like the WeWork guy. And maybe he has it. I don't know. Maybe that's not really fair, but it's people who burn out. people who burn out or have, one idea in the chamber, I think they lack at a personal level. I think they lack it. So their identity is their business.
Yeah,
is what I'm saying. So that's the first thing, and then the second thing is, you have to piece that out and make it more digestible. So you have to have, like, go back to the Apple example. You have to have the iMac as a vision. You have to have all of these other things that people can grasp onto and go after for years.
Yeah,
and years, and invest their personal time in, and then tie all of those things together in this broader vision of innovation, or products that change lives, or however you want to go. Definitely not innovation, because that's too broad, but you get the point.
Also, innovation.
What about the technology side of it?
Such a buzzword. In terms of actually doing it.
Well, sure. You've got a number of things that you've worked on over the course of your career.
I do have a couple of ideas for the vision thing. One is to articulate a goal in terms of the outcome of what happens when you ship this thing that is so outside the norm. Like, we've talked about the idea of, like, a piece of software that it takes, a team of 10 people 6 months to ship. One person should be able to do that in a week, right? And you can't even think about that in terms of today's paradigm of making software. You have to throw out pretty much everything in order to even envision that, right? So that's one way of explaining something, is in terms of an outcome that's, like, impossible by today's standards. Because it forces you to confront and sort of discard your own assumptions about how things are done today. Right?
Right. Yep.
And the other way is to talk about the experience of the person doing the thing. So what I mean is, like to reuse the software example, it's like writing software is a lot of hours of just, like, banging your head against the keyboard, or just tinkering to try to get something to work, just over and over again on this, these individual, like, pieces of minutia that add up to a whole, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So that's describing an experience, and you can sort of put yourself in those shoes and think about that experience, especially if you've had it. But compare that to saying, making software should be like playing jazz. Like, that's a totally different experience. You have an instrument that you're good at, that you enjoy, and you're just up there on stage having fun. Like, that's a completely different experience.
And your point being that if you have that as your audacious goal, then the rest of it sort of falls into place.
Yeah, kind of, because you can put that out there and communicate that to people, and that becomes an organizing principle, especially in contrast to something else. Does this feel like tinkering with minutia, or does this feel like playing jazz? Like, well, which one? And that's your lens through which you can evaluate different product decisions, different technology decisions. So,
yep.
Yeah. Okay. I guess I do have some ideas. I just had to hear your ideas first, and then I thought about why mine were better. No, I don't know. I don't know.
It's like host it. We have this joke that's emerging when Pete and I both host, and it's along the same lines. Oh, I have an idea, as long as my idea is the best idea. I like my idea the most.
Yeah. Well, yeah. You know what? My idea is just
it's a tricky thing to do. No, well, I think the wrestling through it.
Yeah.
So to make it a little bit more accessible, maybe to myself, is when you work through it, it forces you to refine what it is you're doing and why you're doing it, and even that modest amount of effort is oftentimes super valuable and more than a lot of other people do.
Right.
And so just being thoughtful, I think is kind of enough.
I'm going to write that down. Being thoughtful. Check. It's done. Check that off the list.
Startup success done.
No, so the technology one is really interesting because there's a way in which it does kind of harken back to the Roman Empire versus space shuttle example, where like the terminal that I'm running on my computer right now, the interface for it is based off of I believe the TRS-80, which is from something like 1978. Like it's the same software specification for input output, etc. And that's why most editors are configured to 80 characters, because that was the width of the screen. Gary Bernhardt actually gives a really, really good talk about this called A Whole New World. I highly encourage everyone to look it up. I'm about to ruin it for you because it's hilarious. But his idea is he makes a brand new like terminal based editor that's sort of like Vim, but completely different, because you can load up a code file, source code. You can load up a file, source code. And then overlay it with all these different things like recent crashes based on production logs. And then he does this one crazy one where it's like, here's the graph, and it's actually shows like a raster graphics graph of how all the files are related, right?
Sure.
And it's like, that's not a thing you can do in terminal. So he's basically going through like, I wrote an editor. Oh yeah, and to support the editor, I wrote a brand new terminal. And he's like, I wrote all these things, and then he's like, and then he gets to the end of the talk, and he's like, all of this was a lie. I did it all in Keynote. But his point was, it's like all of these things are possible, and we should be at least this point in terms of how we interact with technology, and the fact that we aren't is because no one has gone back and redone any of this stuff.
Is there, we're really close, but just briefly, how do you go back and redo stuff? This is my challenge as a product, kind of more of a product person. Yeah. Is I don't actually want to rebuild the railroad to get my rocket into space.
Maybe you should.
I want to rebuild the railroad. I just don't want to rebuild the railroad as part of my space project.
Yeah. I think that dividing line is going to be different for everybody. Some projects are big enough that you can fit rebuilding the railroad, or at least a section of it, comfortably into scope. I think it forces you to, well, there's a couple of different things. One is you need like a first principles reason about where you're going and why, and what the outcome is supposed to look like. And then everything else is just kind of like budget, right? So it's budget, like, timeline. Yeah. Well, can we move the rocket booster, via highway? Like, can we just close the highways for however many miles? Can we manufacture them somewhere else? So it's like, you start from first principles with the vision, and then you start from first principles in terms of like, okay, what are actually all of our options? Not like what do we think all of our options are, but what are actually all of our options, just purely based on our physical constraints. How do we change those constraints?
Sure. Yeah.
And there's lots of ways to do that.
Right. And what's the name of that book? The constraint is where you win, or something like that.
Oh, the obstacle is the way.
Yeah. It's actually, if you turn it on its head, it's super powerful. I didn't really like that book very much.
I was going to say, I thought you hated that book.
I didn't hate it. I just didn't like it very much. Everybody made it into a big deal, and I didn't really like it. Yeah. Sorry to the poor guy who wrote it.
Everybody should read Essentialism instead. Save your time.
Yeah, I think that's more it. I think there's just so many other really great books out there, and for 2 years, we should probably end on this, but for 2 years, there was this whole plethora of books that got written around one tiny little idea, and then they just stuffed, 150 pages. Yeah. It started to really irritate me.
Could have been a blog post.
Could have been an email to your friend in private.
Gosh, tell me how you really feel.
Oh, poor guy. I'll probably cut all that out. Anyway, okay.
No, don't cut it out.
Maybe I won't. That's it. It's 8:33. I'm going to trim this down to about 25 minutes so we can stop recording.
Cool. Have fun.